Right. We will begin with the session. Whoever joins, we'll let them in. So, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Anshika, and I am from CSPS. We are here collected to discuss the book, and we have with us Dr. Zahra Kazmi, if that is the right way to pronunciate it, and Dr. Sumaira Nawaz. A little about the organization and about the authors and the book to be discussed today. Center for Studies of Plural Society is one of the emerging and rapidly growing nonprofit social sciences research organization in India. And it was established in 2021 and is based out of Delhi. It is a nonprofit, non-partisan, independent institution dedicated to democratizing knowledge and creating access to it by undertaking direct skill development and mentorship of students and research scholars engaged in humanities and social sciences. We have Dr. Zahra Kazmi. She has recently completed her PhD at the University of St. Andrews and holds an MPhil from the University of Cambridge. Her doctoral research explores historical memory and nostalgia in South Asian Muslim writings and analyzing the work of prominent authors against the backdrop of cultural disintegration and sectarian violence in contemporary India. An active academic and public writer, her work spans prominent peer-reviewed journals and major media outlets, the Indian Express. She's also the co-founder of Collective, a research consortium, if that is the right way I'm pronouncing it.
It was the Tasavvur Collective.
Tasavvur, I'm sorry for that. Tasavvur Collective, a research consortium focused on the literary and historical representations of South Asian Muslim. I hope that is right. And we're coming to Dr. Sumaira Nawaz. She's an independent scholar and a former faculty member at NLU Bangalore, NLSUI Bangalore, that is National Law School of Indian University. She has received her PhD from McGill University Institute of Islamic Studies, focusing on global intellectual history and South relations. Her research explores how questions of constitutional morality, minority rights, and modern information culture arose in South Asia in response to literacy network moving through neighboring Muslim empires. By foregrounding the study of Persian and the Urdu periodicals, Dr. Nawaz offers a fresh perspectives on how South Asian Muslim publics historically perceived and intervened in a political upheavals across the Ottoman Empire, Ojad, Iran, and Afghanistan. I'm sorry, it's a little small, so I'm not wearing my specs for that. A little more introduction about the book, and then we are good to go. The session introduces the research underpinning the monograph project, Indo-Muslim Nostalgia, Memory, Modernity, and Nation, presenting an analysis of nostalgia within Indo-Muslim literary aesthetics, contextualizing the study within the political aftermath of 2019 anti-NRC-CAA protests. The discussion traces the roots of this specific effect through the history of Muslim South Asia, accounting for the repeated traumas of colonialism and partition. From Mirza Ghalib's lament for a ruined Delhi post-1857 to Shi'i's aesthetics of grief and remembrance during Muharram, various aspects of Indo-Muslim history and cultural converge in the works of 20th century modernist authors Intizar, Husain, and Qurratulain, Hyder. The novels mourn a civilizational loss while posing profound questions about how shared past continue to shape the contemporary future. Over to you, the panelists.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Anshika. I do want to preface this by saying that this is not a book yet. It is still a thesis and is very much in the process of me trying to convert this into a book. And of course, everyone's feedback in terms of how you think that this research can translate further into different forms, especially as I kind of rethink certain aspects of it, will be really helpful. I think that while kind of the blurb that you shared about the talk, I've kind of stuck mostly to that, but because I realized that, we have limited time on hand, I'm not going to necessarily go into modernism as much, but I'm really happy to expand upon that in Q&A. So yeah, well, I mean, of course, thank you everyone for joining me, and thank you to CSPS for organizing this. I know there was a lot of back and forth in figuring out the dates, and I'm particularly grateful to Sumaira for taking out the time, who has always been very kind to me. When I was a baby first year in Delhi University at Lady Shriram, Sumaira was a starred waiter that I would look up to, and she's always been such a supportive presence. So I'm glad that even though we've not met in person for over a decade now, we've been able, because of our shared intellectual interests, we've been able to stay in touch thanks to the benefits of technology. And yeah, I've always admired her scholarship. So I'm really and admired her scholarship and admired her as a person. So I'm really glad that you're here, Sumaira, to kind of discuss this with me. So yeah, I mean, I'm going to, I guess, kind of start sharing my PowerPoint. Hopefully, we don't have any hiccups there. Maybe once you start seeing my screen, just let me know.
Yeah, it says that you are sharing, but the PPT isn't here yet.
Okay. I'm just gonna.
Yeah, now I see it.
Okay. I'm just going to kind of go in slideshow mode. But yeah, I mean, nonetheless, I think for most of us right now, just kind of starting off, this is a difficult moment, particularly, those of us from India, but even broadly in South Asia, anyone who's following the events of what is happening in Delhi right now, I'm sure is disturbed by the particularly brutal photographs of the horrific violence committed by the Delhi police against peaceful protests by Indian students at Jantar Mantar. These clips, these images have emerged on our feeds. And I think this is actually an important starting point for my talk today as well. Because as journalist Rana Ayub has pointed out in a recent post on Instagram, what we're seeing right now, of course, these are protests that demand accountability and education reform after widespread leaks of entrance examination papers. But what we're seeing unfold is something where fascism and Hindutva nationalism sits right at the core of this. We have seen a massive outpouring of public anger against Prime Minister Modi and his government, with various commentators and protesters asking if this is, as you can see on the left, the death of democracy, or lots of questions that you've probably come across on your social media or in the news about whether this is my India, whose India, etc., etc. The widespread expression of dissent right now that we're seeing is the largest student protest in India since 2019-2020 anti-NRC, anti-CAA NRC riots protests that we saw in Delhi. And this question that haunts this protest that we're seeing today as well, the question of minorities in India, whether it's Muslims, Dalits, rings true and reverberates from 2019-2020 as well. Even as these protests have received more mainstream support than those in 2019-20, there are those of us who are watching with some interest, if I might add, the formerly apolitical and even pro BJP voices now waking up and smelling the very burnt coffee, I would say. the pleas of students from AMU, Jamia, JNU, DU, whose complaints directly challenge the Hindutva rhetoric, compassion by a lot of the similar people right now who are critical of whatever is happening in Delhi. Now, my PhD thesis, which as Anshika very helpfully described, the title was Indo-Muslim Nostalgia, Memory, Modernity, and the Nation in 20th Century South Asian Muslim Writing. And what I'm presenting today is a very brief and generalized snapshot of my argument for public audiences and sort of general non-academic audiences as it appears in my thesis introduction. And in trying to narrow down the why of studying nostalgia and Muslim writing in South Asia, I want to start off with a personal and hopefully productive anecdote. I dwell on, nostalgically perhaps, a few moments that have framed my understanding of this thesis topic, the 2019-20 anti-CAA and NRC protests and my own experience of it as an Indian Shia Muslim woman. So in today's talk, I want to draw some threads around the emergence, forms, and value which nostalgia and cultural memory take on in South Asian culture, Muslim cultural life, to argue that the affect of nostalgia carries potent political charge and is constructed by significant socio-historical forces. Just as nostalgia is an emotion that moves backwards and forwards through time, so does my talk today. I want to, this is why I think it's important to kind of give you a brief outline of the structure of the talk, because while I start off with the protests in 2019-20, I move backwards to engage with the shared Indo-Muslim memory and the partition, the 1857 rebellion, Battle of Plassey, and even some events before that, for instance, Child's War, and the early modern disease that was nostalgia in Europe. So after traveling through time and space, I will introduce some examples of Indo-Muslim literary expression in the 20th and 21st century that use nostalgia in different ways, coming back again to the 2019-20 protests. So hopefully this clarifies the structure a bit if you're ever confused about where I'm going. For those of you who are joining this talk midway, I'm sorry about that. If you join this after this, little summary, hopefully you'll follow. Okay, so in the winter of, sorry, I'm just gonna go, yeah, I think this is fine. In the winter of 2019-20, as widespread protests erupted across India after Prime Minister Modi's government passed the Citizenship Amendment Act, which introduced religion as a criterion for citizenship for the first time. The act, in conjunction with the National Register for Citizens, NRC, was seen by many as a measure being used to effectively declare thousands of Muslims citizens stateless. Approximately 2 million Indians, mostly Muslims, were declared illegal and housed in detention camps. Starting in Assam, the protests spread swiftly to Delhi. I'm just going to go back to those original photos. With Shaheen Bagh, a Muslim-dominated area of Southeast Delhi, becoming the main site of the protests. I was working as a teaching fellow at a private university on the outskirts of Delhi at the time, and the change in the pulse of the capital was palpable. I would occasionally visit Shaheen Bagh to express solidarity, fearful of mob violence, mob or police violence, but also immensely inspired by the tenacity of the protesters. When I was not at Shaheen Bagh, I was breathlessly following the coverage of the protests in the news or catching up on the relentless on-ground organizing WhatsApp group chats I seem to have found myself in. The anti-CAA movement saw a huge stream of creative expression, with protesters publicly singing protest anthems, reciting poetry, staging street theater, creating political art and murals during their months-long sit-ins. My classroom was buzzing with excitement. Journalists were clamoring to Delhi to report the massive outpouring of support directed at the Dadis of Shaheen Bagh. Alongside these acts of solidarity, however, there was also immense vitriol, as the protests were followed by large-scale anti-Muslim riots in Delhi and the rampant demonizations of the protesters by mainstream media. Every major Indian city was witnessing their own protests and marches, and dozens of protesters were killed during police firing and clashings. It was both a hopeful and terrifying moment in my life, watching students, activists, and citizens stand united against a politics of hate and division, while also fearing for the lives of friends and family. These protests were largely led by students and Muslim women. While it found widespread support from individuals belonging to various religious backgrounds, the anti-CAA protests were an unapologetic and explicit assertion of Indian Muslim identity. As Professor Purvanand wrote for The While, not only were Muslims emphasizing that they have equal rights in India, but also that Muslimness is as naturally Indian as Hinduness. The winter of 2019-20 was also the time that I was frantically applying to PhD programs. And in the UK and US, I was refining some vague ideas that I had around nostalgia and Muslim literary culture, building on a master's dissertation around Muslim femininity and colonialism for a year before the protests began. As I fleshed out my PhD proposal and anxiously awaited for decisions from various universities, something about the value of this project felt like it was reaffirmed in that winter of discontent in Delhi. While I could see that the project of Hindutva nationalism had been bent on eradicating the traces of Muslimness from India for years, the events of 2019-20 brought Indian Muslims into international political focus. Suddenly, Indian Muslims gathered at protest sites and recited Pakistani progressive poet Faiz Ahmad Faiz's ghazal, Hum Dekhenge, as a rallying cry. My ideas began to feel like they had urgent, real-world implications that went beyond an obscure book or two. While my PhD research was never about Urdu poetry or Marxist movements, like the progressives that Faiz belonged to, at least it didn't center him, it did center the capacity of memory and literary sentiments to counter narrow, exclusionary narratives of community or nationhood to instead reveal a more nuanced idea of belonging. The examples that I discuss in the second half of this lecture talk speak to a few different terms: mourning, grief, pathos, melancholia, trauma, political memory, all of which gesture towards the affective core of my argument. These affective and conceptual forms coalesce in nostalgia, which is the object of my inquiry, especially as it relates to these aforementioned terms. Indo-Muslim literary tradition merits investigation through the lens of this temporally bound affect in order to reveal its political and aesthetic nuances, particularly in relation to the partition, which redefined, I would say, the boundaries of nation and identity for the Indian Muslim community, whether it was psychologically, whether it was socially, whether it was geographically. The importance of memory in allowing us to challenge the politics of the present cannot be understated, be it in poems, prose, or films, or TV shows, or the visions of justice and syncretism that the anti-NRC-CAA protesters, and today some very brave students right now that we're seeing in Jantar Mantar and other spaces across various cities, voice in their protests. The multidirectional temporality of this affective formulation, right, where the past, present, and future collide, repeats itself in another example from the NRC-CAA protest. Perhaps the best way to bookend the preface that I'm trying to kind of build here in this lecture. You may remember Bilqis Bano, or Bilqis Dadi as she was fondly called, one of the sort of most visible older Muslim women who were involved in the sit-in, who kind of led the sit-in at Shaheen Bagh. And she became the face of the protest, alongside obviously student activists like Umar Khalid and Kanhaiya. She was interviewed by the journalist Tavleen Tarrant for Al Jazeera. Interestingly, the article starts off again with this past-present comparison between Bilqis Dadi and a revolutionary queen from the 1857 rebellion, Rani Lakshmi Bai of Jhansi, who is a woman from history that Bilqis claims to admire the most. The article even ends, and as you will see in the quote here, with a direct comparison between Lakshmi Bai and Bilqis. So Tarrant writes that one of Rani of Jhansi's most iconic quotes, as we know, was "Main Jhansi nahi dungi," I will not give up my Jhansi. And she calls it a patriotic battle cry for the India that she yearned for, an independent India free of colonial rule. And she compares Bilqis and says that Bilqis too is fighting for an India of plurality, harmony, and cohesiveness that she will not give up on. Much of the protests reference this idea of reclaiming my India, quote unquote, from the current political dispensation, a desire to, again, go back, and I'll emphasize that, to my India, as opposed to Modi's new India. This backwards movement was oriented towards bringing a transformative politics that drew from the past. I contend that grief and nostalgia, particularly in the context of politicized affect, especially within South Asian secular left-leaning voices, are connected. We know that the 1857 uprising against the British failed and Lakshmibai herself died in battle. The anti-CAA protests have not been successful in getting the law to be repealed, and dozens of activists have been jailed by the government as political prisoners, and many are no closer to being released even today. The symbolism evoked by a resilient warrior queen is what mattered, much like the heroic resistance of students and activists and Muslim women in the face of crushing power. The Indian left thrives on nostalgia for heroic failures. So this scholar who I really like, Sarah Fatima Waheed, in her book Hidden Histories of Pakistan, writes that progressive Urdu poetry and literature serves as a reservoir for South Asian left intellectuals and movements to nostalgically articulate utopian possibilities of and freedom struggles. She notes that there exists a tension in this kind of discourse, right, where we view the progressives in as kind of a utopian project celebrating like romantic revolutionary ideals, versus the tension of viewing them as failing to organize successfully enough to prevent communalist violence. And this apparent failure of the movement in the present does not compromise the political power of memory. We grieve what was lost, not what we already have. The loss or lack is what fuels the resistance and the promise of a better future, even if both the original loss that is being commemorated or the possibility that of the future that is being aspired towards are not real or true in the factual sense. Nostalgia and grief still mourn the possibilities that existed or that have existed and can create more possibilities for the future. So in the same interview, right, with Bilqis, Tarrant asks Bilqis what her desire for India is, and there's a she responds to this very interestingly. She says, "I want religious harmony. I want everyone to be together again, like how it was before." And she says that we are Indians and we've been in India for a long time and never thought to leave anywhere else because we want to stay here. Where there are so many religions, cultures, blah blah blah. My dream for India is to go back to how it was before, everyone together in peace, cooking together, eating together. I mean, that quote is not in the image, but that's kind of, you read the article, you see her say that. Now, this desire, right, that Bilqis Bano articulates of everyone getting back together like how it was before, is commonly reflected amongst Indian secular voices. Even as we resonate with the sentiment, it begs the question of when exactly were we all together? What was it like before? Before what exactly were we all, a big happy family? One might think that, she's maybe referencing, you might expect her, considering the political context, that she's referencing the Modi's rise to power in 2014 and the period before that, but that's not what she's referencing. She's clearly referencing the partition. And while she doesn't explicitly say that, she says that, that she wants to kind of go back to how it was before, where everyone was together. And the fact that she chose to stay here, right? That there's an importance here placed on the idea of Muslims who chose to stay on in India. Every conversation about discrimination or injustice towards Indian Muslims scratches the original wound of partition and a desire to uphold a nostalgic vision of India as a syncretic land of civilization and religious plurality, right? She says that Muslims are Indians and have been here for a long time, and that the Muslims who are currently living in India never left. The right of Muslims to assert their citizenship and demand equal rights from the state is based on the notion of choosing to stay on in India versus those who left. Partition is then the ghost that haunts Indian Muslims as they consider their present and future in India. The moment of decolonization in South Asia was accompanied by constitutive violence of the partition. The cost of freedom was dislocation, exclusion, expulsion, resettlement. People across different religious identities experienced bloodshed and violence that led to large-scale population exchange. But it was Muslims who experienced a unique reconfiguration of their identities across both countries, wherein they were both a majority in Pakistan and a sizable minority in India. While Hindus and Sikhs moved en masse, the demographic redistribution that occurred as a consequence of the religious violence that we saw with the partition shaped Muslim identity by dividing them across two and then eventually three with the creation of Bangladesh nation states. So in the Indian context, this has meant that the Muslim is viewed with suspicion and anxiety when it comes to questions of patriotism and Indianness. Now, many Indian Muslims have felt burdened carrying the weight of nation and community, and have also felt compelled to invisibilize or repress any cultural similarities with Muslims in Pakistan for protection against violence or preventing accusations of treason. So Ananya Jahara Kabir, who's a scholar that I draw from, says that to be a part of the mainstream, the Indian Muslim had to take on the secularist doctrine with an excess of good faith and enthusiasm. And even as, the Indian Muslim may be trapped within the ill feelings that spin out from the collective memory of partition as fratricide meaning that, I think, like as destroying family. I see the Indian Muslim as a cipher, she says, for created through the partition. This idea of the cipher, right? The cipher being a code, a symbol. You see this in the work of Qurratulain Hyder as well, who is one of the writers I look at more explicitly in my PhD thesis, and her novel The River of Fire. She, talks about muhajirs who are Indian Muslims of Indian descent who kind of moved to Pakistan, Urdu-speaking Muslims, to Karachi, lamenting that for these children who are born to muhajir parents, India will always remain a cipher. Word when we consider how identities take on meanings. Now, when I moved to the UK for my master's, I was interacting with people from all across the world and also Pakistani that I met during that time, right? Though many Pakistanis I met shared my faith and language, we often marveled at our cultural similarities. We were acutely aware of the fact that our identities were distinctly Indian or Pakistani, and there could be no denial of the nearly 8 decades of divergent histories as two separate nations that neither of us could fully inhabit. And yet, in moments as they recounted stories of a grandparent who had migrated from Ambala or Hyderabad, a passion for Bollywood cinema, the classic diaspora, like we are all actually the same only kind of moments that I think a lot of us experience when we go abroad and actually meet people from Pakistan. You realize that you share a lot. And as one of them, that they see they were formerly Indian, almost Indian, or as one of them joked, ex-Indian. And I think that if the narrative of partition for Pakistanis, I think it's very interesting. As I was discussing with a friend, she was talking about how Shah Rukh Khan for them is again like almost like a ghost-like figure for a lot of Pakistani Muslims, because he represents the possibility that could have existed had they chosen to stay on in India in some ways, like this idea of this beloved superstar who's so successful and well loved across both sides of the border. And so if the narrative of partition for Pakistanis, which is obviously true and based in fact that Muslims were forced to live in an onslaught of violence and horror, what do Indian Muslims who stayed on represent for them? The question should not deny that the Muslims, who had to leave were directly materially affected by the violence, but instead signals again the possibilities of what could have been, of possibilities that could have been articulated had the violence and exclusionary narratives of nation states not destroyed them. So then I contend that perhaps Pakistani Muslims too were haunted by the partition, albeit in a different way than I was. I'm consciously trying to reflect on a longer, deeper memory of Indo-Muslim identity that would forever carry the reverberations of what existed before and after the partition. As I conceptualized my research, I became conscious of an affective connection between these forms of loss and nostalgia, which correlated with the shifts in Indo-Muslim literary culture in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. I try and tease out these layers of this affect in my thesis itself with post-partition literature, but I think it's important to kind of briefly recap this history to kind of look at this longer trajectory that Indo-Muslim nostalgia is a part of. So nostalgia was from a bad reputation. Even I'm far from the first scholar to discuss the progressive possibilities within nostalgia. But there's still a broad tendency to view that emotion as regressive. Critics of nostalgia have described the nostalgic impulse as an inherently conservative one, favoring simplistic historical narratives. But there was something about the nostalgia of these South Asian Muslim novelists whose characters were forced to make grave choices in the partition, where factors that went beyond their individual control would determine decisions about a new collective future. I found some sort of emotional resonance and kinship as I found, the demands of career and politics kind of drawing me away from India in their writing. For them, this attachment to land and its ethos went beyond the state-sponsored narratives of citizenship, and instead it spoke of a more real and intimate feeling that was rooted in the local topos and ethos, a deeply felt love for place and people, memory allowing them to travel beyond the confines of national ideology. I write thus in memory of memory. So I'm going to give a little recap on why nostalgia here, right? So even as I'm writing, I'm speaking to you from post-Brexit Britain. We're seeing what Trump is saying in America about making America great again. So there are obviously dangerous forms that nostalgia can take. There's no denying. But much like the South Asian Muslim writers that I'm interested in, I think nostalgia can also give us a sense of continuity, a sense of and particularly literature that has that affective posture maintains fidelity to the losses that the reigning ideological formation would like us to disavow. My approach to nostalgia is now indebted to these progressive understandings of progressive nostalgia by scholars like Svetlana Boym, or my supervisor, Anindya Roy Chaudhary, or Kamala Cassidy's excellent book, Twilight Histories, on nostalgia and the Victorian historical novel. But I'm less interested in kind of defending nostalgia as an important kind of mode to think about literature and culture. But I'm because I feel like other scholars have done that work already, but I'm more interested in thinking about how these sort of radical and subversive foundations itself of the affect are reflected in both its global and South Asian histories. So in the West, the term nostalgia was coined by Swiss physician Johannes Hofer. You can see him on the right in 1688 as a part of his medical dissertation. You can see a little small image of his dissertation. He identified nostalgia as an illness occurring amongst Swiss mercenary soldiers, drawing from, again, this is also an interesting fact that nostalgia, the word itself, is a neologism. So he takes something from the past, which is drawing from Homer's Odyssey, and combines the Greek roots of nostos, which means return home, and algos, which means pain or longing, to create this word nostalgia. And he says it's a sad mood originating from the desire to return to one's native land and connected to a particular form of pathos and longing. He describes nostalgia as a cerebral disease, as a disorder, as being born out of a disordered imagination. And he claims that the symptoms of nostalgia were nausea, loss of appetite, fever, palpitations, and even suicidal ideation, all while obsessively remembering the sensations, sounds, and otherwise forgotten minutiae of their homeland. By the end of the 18th century, throughout Europe, doctors recognized nostalgia as a frequently fatal disease, and they all agreed that people of all races were vulnerable to it, from Lapps in Greenland to the enslaved Black people in America and the Caribbean. it is no coincidence that Hofer's definition emerges in the early modern period as a response to the destruction and dislocation of war when national boundaries were being redrawn. If modernity is, characterized by a particular temporal consciousness, one where the sense of historical discontinuity or there's a rupture with the past and a realization of, say, an ambiguity of the future, and there's scholars like Reinhard Kossel, that's how they talk about modernity. It is worth noting that the period of great kind of remaking of boundaries and the creation of multiple homes, right? So this is what Amindir Roy Chaudhary writes, between the lines of power that delineate a national home, a regional home, a local home, start shifting in this period. And around the same time, right? So 2 years before Hofer published his dissertation, we see the first war that the East India Company begins on Indian soil, which was called Child's War, which is, I think, a funny name, but it was led by Josiah Child, or the first Anglo-Mughal War between 1686 and 1690. Now, aiming to capture the extremely wealthy provinces of Bengal, the British soldiers launched an attack on the Mughals, only to be resoundingly defeated and forced to offer groveling apologies and pay heavy penalty of around 1,50,000 rupees to Emperor Aurangzeb at the time. Unknown to the Mughals and even the British at the time, this failed attempt at seizing power by the East India Company was only the beginning of the end for Muslim rule in India. Less than a century later, in 1757, led by Robert Clive, the forces defeated Siraj-ud-Daulah, as we know, in the Battle of Plassey, and this seismic event marked the start of company rule in India, and they effectively began to start controlling large swaths of mainland India. By the end of the 18th century, Mughal power only existed in name, and you probably all know this already, but I'm just recapping briefly. In 1856, the Nawab Wajid Ali Shah is exiled to Calcutta. Lucknow is taken over. 1857, we see the mutiny break out, and even though there were some initial advances, the rebels were defeated by the British within a year, and a devastatingly violent reprisal followed. Bahadur Shah Zafar, who was the Mughal king at the time, and was sort of forced in a lot of historians argue to lead the mutiny against his own will, or the rebellion, sorry, against his own will, was exiled to Rangoon in Burma, and his sons and grandsons were publicly executed by the British at Delhi's Khuni Darwaza. Much of the city of Lucknow, the capital of Awadh, was razed during the battles between the British and the rebels, and the psychological and material rupture that was created by 1857 had a profound impact on the elite Indo-Muslim imagination. So, and people like Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, who were documenting the events of what was happening in 1857. And he wrote in 1858 his famous pamphlet, Asbab-e-Baghawat-e-Hind, which is, you can see a little image of the translation, the OUP version of that, which is called The Causes of the Indian Rebellion. So he becomes like one of those examples. And as we know, Sir Syed Ahmad Khan was also the biggest spearhead of Muslim reform in India in the 19th century. So again, you see this little connection, right, between the loss of the past and then thinking about how to imagine a new future for Muslims happening at the same time in the 19th century. And someone like Sir Syed becomes a very good example, or of that kind of tension that exists, coexists. So I'm certainly not the first to query this relationship between nostalgia and Indo-Muslim literary culture. There are scholars like Margaret Panau and Yves Tignol who've done really important work. Sumaira herself looks at, I think, 19th century connections in her research, and affect to some degree. So I think while this work exists, there's still scope to look at 20th century versions of this affect, and particularly when it comes to post-partition Muslim writing, which is the period that I focus on. So in this final section of my talk, as we kind of come to a close, I want to of Karbala and its commemoration in Muharram outline the central role that memory plays in Indo-Muslim literary and political expression. For those unaware, Karbala was the battlefield in Iraq on which Husain, the Prophet's grandson, and his small band of followers were killed in about 680 AD by the forces of their political rivals, Umayyads, led by Emperor Yazid. It is a site of great religious importance to Muslims, particularly Shiites, and Muharram is observed every year, as you are probably aware, to commemorate these events. So a long line of writers and thinkers as diverse as Premchand, Iqbal, Gandhi have used Indo-Muslim memory and the events of Karbala to speak about national belonging. The examples I've chosen in this section are a bit idiosyncratic. One is a ghazal by Muhammad Ali Jauhar, who I was initially discussing with Sumaira, for those of you who joined the call earlier. And the other is a novel by Qurratulain Hyder, a little extract from a novel. And the final one is an opinion piece in a national daily by a concerned citizen, I think. They all zoom in on the context of Indo-Muslim cultural memory to articulate a more expansive politics. Now, I am not, and I would like to say this at the outset, a specialist in Indo-Muslim, a specialist in Urdu poetry, and my thesis actually looks at novels. But I think this ghazal by Muhammad Ali Jauhar, the Indian freedom fighter and founder of the Khilafat movement, is such a good example of this kind of expansive political and temporal imagination that marks Indo-Muslim literary expression. Now, seemingly addressed towards the colonizer, this ghazal attempts to reinvigorate the masses against oppression. So he says, "Daur-e hayat aayega qatil qaza ke baad." Life will begin after the decree of justice is announced against you, O killer. Hai ibtida hamari teri intiha ke baad. Our beginning lies beyond your fatal breath. Qatle Husain asl mein marge Yazid hai. Islam zinda hota hai har Karbala ke baad. The martyrdom of Husain is actually the death of Yazid. Islam is revived after every Karbala. Mumkin hai nala jabr se ruk bhi sake agar. Hum par to hai wafa ka taqaza jafa ke baad. It is possible my lamentations may be halted by force, but we promise justice once tyranny has stopped. So this is a man writing this in prison, right? And this ghazal, Jauhar is almost cast as a vengeful lover. He's discussing how despite the degradations and censorship, the violence that is heaped upon him, the colonized will ensure the end of tyrannical rule of the British. In a reference to Karbala, he reminds the reader that the martyrdom of Husain was actually the end of Yazid, the tyrannical Umayyad caliph, whose rule Husain refused to accept. In his sacrifice, Islam was saved, and similarly, he suggests that his sacrifice is what will bring about the revival, bringing back the time of life, or Daur-e Hayat, as he calls it, this time of flourishing. Now, it is worth noting here that Muhammad Ali Jauhar died in 1931 and spent his last few decades in and out of prison. The anti-colonial Khilafat and non-cooperation movements which he was involved with failed to, and champion had failed to achieve the desired outcomes, and he never saw India achieve freedom during his lifetime. The injustices of imprisonment and its accompanying pain continue to fuel his poetic verses, carrying in them visions of hopefulness. The temporal formulation of the ghazal reflects this. The future will be the past. The injustices endured while fighting against colonialism will revive Islam and the nation, just as Karbala led to the rebirth of Islam. Now, Muharram returns as symbolized as a symbolic of politicized mourning in Qurratulain Hyder's classic River of Fire, Rag Ka Darya. So she describes that amidst the row of shops in Lucknow, the ancient gates lead to the Maqbara compound. So she's kind of describing the city, and while there is the mausoleum of Amjad Ali Shah, Wajid Ali Shah. She's again going back to that history of pre-colonial Lucknow. She talks about how the Imambara was converted to a church when General Outram conquered the city in 1857. And it's actually this painting that you see on the left, which is called The Relief of Lucknow by Thomas Barker, actually kind of talks about this specific moment. Shows this specific moment, sorry. And after some time, she talks about how, it didn't stay on as a church and was given back to the Muslims to resume their dirge for Imam Husain, to which they now also mourn the loss of Awadh, right? So amongst the many acts of architectural reconstitution that post-1857 Lucknow saw, the conversion of a crucial religious site for Lucknow's Muslims into a church was a major symbolic slight. Once the Muslims were handed back their Imambara, religious mourning during Muharram now commemorates the injustices of the British. Hyder also inscribes political mourning onto the topos of the modern city, particularly tied to Muslim histories of religious and cultural memorialization. Something similar happens in this editorial piece I came across by someone called Zehra Naqvi, another Zehra, called A Spectacle Resistance, How Shining Bagh Reminded Me of the Power of Protests in the Story of the Battle of Karbala. So I'm not going to read the entire thing here, but just to focus on the bits that I have highlighted here. So she compares the Indian national flag, which obviously the protesters were carrying, to the alam, which is a symbolic replica of the flag that is carried by Abbas, Husain's brother. And she talks about how Nohas or Marsiyas or Sohs or Salams, which are again lamentation songs, basically, or different forms of lamentation poetry in Muharram, she kind of sees them emerge in the chants of the protesters against the government. And she compares, again, we go back to Hum Dekhenge by Faiz Ahmad Faiz, to a Noha that kind of articulates resistance. So she says that it was only in January 2020 that she finally understood the metaphorical significance of the Matam, which is obviously public mourning that a lot of particularly Shia Muslims, but also Muslims from Sunni Muslims, other Muslims, do to form, like, commemorate mourning or shared cultural loss, which is beating their chests, not just as a symbol of grief, but also as a symbol of protest. There's a difference, obviously, between the secular nationalism that Taqvi mourns, or the loss of Awadh that Hyder is talking about, or the return to the call of the oppressed that in some ways in the colonial period, right? So that Jauhar is talking about, but this renewed significance that we see in the contemporary political context for Muslims of grief and resistance is important here. And it shows that it is a part of this longer trajectory of using political memory for protest, for resistance in Indo-Muslim literary culture and public and literary expression. So till now, we've established that nostalgia has performed then a unique cultural function for Indian Muslims, and which is why this kind of idea of critical nostalgia, which is what I offer, maybe as I kind of wrap up this talk, is important here, because I see that as a kind of practice or a form of thinking about community representation and in art that includes depictions of lives of Muslims, where they command greater cultural and political primacy. So therefore, they don't exist as the minority, but as the center, but as the mainstream in these works. Their minoritization, of course, and the resulting violent precarity is not the defining feature of Indo-Muslim nostalgic narratives from the outset, usually set in North Indian or Urdu-speaking sociocultural milieus. Indo-Muslim nostalgic works involve a self-conscious exploration of the social mores of the community, an intricately woven network with diverse caste and class representations. Pathos emanating from the realization of an irretrievable past marks these works, since the narrative anticipates a diminished future or extinction awaiting the community. While they might center a Muslim perspective, they draw heavily from syncretic pluralistic heritage of the subcontinent, drawing from Hindu, Buddhist, Sikh, or Christian cultural beliefs. I argue that there exists a critical spirit in post-partition Muslim engagement with nostalgia, which seeks to deconstruct the present. While rooted in this particular context that I'm talking about, I call this approach critical because it sheds lights on the possibilities that that this memory can offer. By expanding the temporal regimes of the present, I hope to detect pluralities within cultures, traditions, and of dissent and dignity for the defeated in history. Therefore, I see critical nostalgia of Indo-Muslim literature as a product of political grief and informed by an experience of loss and trauma. It views history through a whimsical, diasporic, and cosmopolitan lens, allowing narrative space for play and freedom from the temporal regimes of the present. Critical nostalgia questions the cartography of nations and the divisions of the present. It recognizes the imperfectibility of the past and the limitations of narrative subjectivity, but still offers possibilities for reimagining the future. While critical nostalgia remains deeply sentimental and attached to its past, it is fundamentally a clear-eyed awareness of the permanence of change. Thank you. And this is my email address in case anyone wants to contact me after this.
That was a well detailed, and yet again, I think it wasn't boring at all as you assumed it to be.
Okay.
It was
I'm
very
glad.
rich in detail and at the same time very deeply human. I mean, to the way that you have connected your thesis and brought it down to words that people can understand that simpler and relatable.
I'm glad.
To Dr. Sumaira.
Yeah, I think I can take over my chair duties now. Firstly, thank you so much for CSPS, for Kashif, and for Anshika for organizing everything. This has been exceptionally smooth and very, very exciting. I also had the privilege of reading Zahra's very lengthy introduction. So those 16,000 words were all as entertaining as the presentation too.
I hope you didn't read all of it.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't put it down. So I'm very excited to see this as a monograph. And I think nostalgia, now that we are on the topic, also does this thing that it makes you imagine a golden past of undergrad seniors, and you use aggrandizing adjectives for them, but she's a dear colleague from whom we continue to learn. And for those who are interested in more of Zahra's work, and also that how scholarship expands networks and community, the Tasavvur Collective is an excellent platform where she, along with two other scholars, organized this large online conference, primarily with Muslim women scholars, or women scholars particularly, in 2022. So I would highly encourage the participants in this Zoom call to go and look at Zahra's other scholarship and other community-driven scholarly work. And before I go on into my questions for Zahra, I thought, again, just to break it down for people, I thought, as someone with background in Muslim intellectual history, I can point out to the places where Zahra's scholarship contributes to the sites that she's speaking to. One being the relevance of novel as an archive. So one thing has been that we have focused on political magazines, literary magazines, constitutional debates, memoirs even. But when it comes to fiction, either it has to abide by certain idea of a nationalist Muslim, or it would be a literary or cultural narrative that doesn't speak about the nation primarily, but has certain ideas of literary aesthetic that abides by a secular Muslim who does not have a very strong political voice. So here we have a clear focus on post-partition novels, post-partition Muslim voices that otherwise will not be featured in your Imtiaz Ali films. Like the flows or trajectories of partition will only be seen as Sikh and Hindu exodus and exceptional violence that they face, but not the kind of violence and the kind of a breakdown of a sense of belonging that Muslims who were living in India and then were forced to evacuate both during and after partition. So that, again, is an archive that is in urgent need of research, cinematically and otherwise. So we have Zahra contributing to that. The second one being that this scholarship is also in conversation with new partition research. So with again, earlier we had Fazila Yaqub Ali Zamindar. Now we have Rotem Giva and Zehra's brilliant supervisor, Anindya Roy Chaudhary. All of them discussing that it wasn't Muslims one day decided that this partition is what they want, this is what the demand for Pakistan means, and then packed their bags and left. But rather, there is an entire bureaucratic infrastructure through the Evacuee Property Act or the Enemy Property Act that is created, crafted well into the 60s that forces Muslims repeatedly to leave. So the ones, and as Zehra points out in her introduction and her presentation, the Muslims who stayed back, one being that, yes, it was probably an ideological choice, probably were always in support of certain idea of the Indian nation state that the Indian National Congress abided by. But the other one being that probably were everyday people who are not politically quite literate, but were facing exceptional legal, infrastructural, and physical violence, because of which they were forced to leave. And that's the kind of trajectory of forced in Muslim exodus from India towards West Pakistan that has not been sufficiently acknowledged. So that's, again, through fiction, Zehra has also filled that gap. The third one coming down to, which is something that the presentation did not particularly address, but because I was a privileged one with the introduction, I do know that this tension between the progressive writers' movements, so Tarakki Pasand, and then you have Rajat Pasand, the modernists, and the kind of writers who have become very famous with our literary histories are overwhelmingly belong to the progressive. Not that there is a clear binary between the two. Literary magazines also don't outlaw, say, an Intizar Husain from writing in a magazine that is overwhelmingly Tarakki Pasand or progressive. So it's not to say that communist and anti-communist are clear boundaries. Your support for USSR or for China clearly determines which magazine you're going to contribute to. That's not what I'm trying to say. That's not what Zehra claims. But to say, like, there are these literary tropes or aesthetics that become more common with the modernists, who are very uncomfortable with a break from the past, a future that has to have political equality, a future that speaks of the farmers, the students, the workers. But another side is also a loss of culture, a loss of political sovereignty. However elite this culture might have been, it still was part of the zeitgeist. It defined Muslim ideas of the self. So how is it that writers like Qurratulain, Hyder, or Ahmad Ali, how is it that they, or Intizar Hussain particularly, how is it that these writers in their fiction are portraying a complete Muslim collapse when it comes to a sense of belonging to this geography that we now call South Asia? And that doesn't abide to any idea of secular nationalism. It does not obsess with the idea of Muslims must prove their patriotic sense of belonging to India, but rather it harks back to a conception of a golden past that has been created, that this is how we spoke, this is what we ate, this is what we wore. It is pluralistic, it is inclusive, albeit with its own limits, but this is what we lost during partition. So not just, again, the great Urushi Butalia with her other side of silence. Yes, that physical and traumatizing sexual violence that we acknowledge, but also a complete collapse of cultural sensibilities. So again, now these are the fields that Zehra is contributing to, and this is very exciting scholarship. And finally, if I may use my chair privileges to pose my two questions first before we open it up to all the participants. Zehra, my first question, very briefly, progressive writers and poets like Kaifi Azmi or Ali Sardar Jafri all rely on the ghazal form. Sure, they write nazms too, but here the ghazal is this form that they overwhelmingly use to popularize their own sloganeering and their own perception of a political future. Meanwhile, the modernists are taking the novel form while also harking back to this nostalgic golden past that they have created. So I'm very curious as to how you handle this tension between traditionalist Indo-Persian form, if I may use traditional with your double quotes, while also discussing a past that has to be erased, while also engaging with a contemporary future of complete political minoritization that Indian Muslims post-partition are dealing with. And my second question, again, how much of nostalgia do you see as a literary aesthetic that, oh, this is how we are going to imagine our emotional self when we are discussing us staying in post-partition India as minorities and politically marginalized citizens whose belonging is always under suspicion? How much of it is a literary aesthetic, and how much of it is some sort of a continuation of, say, tropes like writing of Karbala? Premchand also wrote Dastane Karbala. Or if you have Sheher-Ashob as a tradition after revolt of 1857, or Nadir Shah ransacking Delhi, again, a trope through which you describe not only a loss of political sovereignty, cultural self, but a complete collapse of life as you know it. So difference between trope and literary aesthetic. I hope that made sense.
Yes. Oh, this is yeah, thank you so much, Samara. This was actually so helpful. I was noting down everything you were saying because I was like, I should know what my own contributions are before, So thank you. That was so generous of you, and I really appreciate you taking out the time to, first of all, read. So as I infamously last minute I didn't, and also because I'm in the middle of moving, I wasn't able to send my PowerPoint to Samara in advance, so I just sent her my very long introduction to my thesis and said, don't read the whole thing, just have a look at it so you can briefly kind of see what I'm trying to talk about. But you have very kindly read the whole thing and provided such useful feedback. So thank you. I really appreciate that. In terms of the questions here that you've kind of posed, I think the first one about the I was wondering if you would bring up Sheher-Ashob, but this kind of tension between form, the traditional form versus new form is very interesting with modernism, because a lot of their experimental approach, particularly in the novel form, where they kind of very self-consciously borrow from the Anglo American, or the British modernists, or kind of broader European traditions of modernism that emerge, and therefore rely a lot on myth and history, just as someone like, say, T.S. Eliot would, kind of the emphasis on say myth in drawing back to a new, going back to myth, or someone like Yeats, but utilizing that to talk about a new context, right? A post-war context, post-First World War context, that they, and thinking about the role of literature in that changed world. Similarly, I would say the modernists respond to the partition with a really interesting eclectic style of literary sort of formal experimentation. So the novels kind of switch between different temporal and sort of linguistic forms that they'll take on, so styles. And there's also this interest in kind of seeing how the sort of, again, and this is, of course, there are storytelling traditions, and within Indo-Muslim culture, there's someone like Amina Yaqeen has done interesting work on, like, what was the first Urdu novel, for instance. There's a great paper by her if anyone is interested. But broadly, the rise of the novel in Urdu or Indo-Muslim cultural traditions, because obviously some of the writers that I'm interested in write just in English, is a much later is a much later development, and the tradition of poetry is much longer, much older, and poetry continues to inform the novel and the different versions and avatars it takes on over the late 19th and 20th centuries. So Sheher-Ashob, which you briefly mentioned, is a big thing for someone like Intizar Husain. So his novels become kind of this prose form of the Sheher-Ashob, where they're often sort of very spatially bound. So he's very interested in the space of like, if a novel like Basti starts off with these gorgeous depictions of a village in Bulandshahr, which is which is what Munnan is remembering it, who's the narrator, but it's also very much heavily inspired from Husain's own childhood in UP. And he calls it Roopnagar in the novel. But then Roopnagar kind of coalesces into, suddenly becomes the Delhi of 1857. It becomes the violent, Karachi of the 1970s. It becomes the loss of Andalus, Granada, and Cordoba for the Moorish Muslims and the loss of the end of Islamic Spain. So you see, and he kind of very consciously draws from these traditions of poetic mourning that have existed in Marsyas, that have existed in Sher Ashub, but plays with them in the prose form. So it's very interesting how he kind of does that. Someone like him, even Qurratulain Hyder does that again and again in The River of Fire. So I think these poetic traditions, it's interesting that you're right, that in terms of formal experimentation, the progressives remain quite true to tradition. They don't change around the form of the ghazal that much necessarily. I mean, of course, there are forms of experimentation that some people like I think Makhdoom Moinuddin do, or where they kind of there's but overall they're largely more they remain they show their fidelity to their classical training in some ways. But the novelists who emerge kind of this generation, who are sort of either after them or kind of they were involved with the progressive writers movement, kind of break apart, play around a lot more with form, and kind of are interested in seeing the limits of how much they can stretch the novel to accommodate poetry, I think. Particularly someone like Intizar Husain. So yeah, and I think the second question about nostalgia as trope and aesthetic, I think this is a very interesting question, because I honestly don't see necessarily that much of a difference between the two. I think that trope and literary aesthetic are very much sort of informing each other. So there's a scholar called Farida Zaman who is very interested in the conception of the nostalgic Muslim in the Khilafat movement, right? What does the trope of nostalgia do when we think about the Khilafat movement now, right? About kind of these Muslims as these backward-looking Muslims who are kind of just interested in bringing about a revival of Islam, and they're not really that interested in independence, is how we kind of broadly understand it. But she kind of queries that depiction and is more interested in thinking about how nostalgia is actually a more expansive affect or emotion, or whatever you want to call it, trope. And I think there is a self-conscious, I mean, of course, there is the use of pathos and longing and loss is such an old tradition in storytelling, in poetry, in Indo-Muslim cultures. So I think both the trope and the affect kind of inform each other. So the idea of the vengeful lover, right? For instance, we saw in Jauhar, right? Who is, because it's almost romantic, the poem is, who's saying that how dare you, like, separate me from you, or reject me, or humiliate me. That idea of this excessive emotion, right, that kind of is channeled in very interesting ways with nostalgia, and kind of both kind of obviously in terms of the endpoint or the other object of nostalgia, right? But also in terms of the temporal markers that this nostalgia kind of channels, right? So it can go back to Karbala, but it can also talk about 1857, and can also talk about the national movement in the 1930s or 20s, I think, which is when this poem is written. So yeah, I think that I don't necessarily see the trope and literary aesthetic as different from each other. I see them as very much informing each other.
No, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. These are great questions, though. I will think more about this. Yeah.
As we move ahead, I would like the participants, if they have any questions for Zahra. Dr. Zahra. Sorry. Yes, you can unmute yourself and go ahead with your question.
Hi,
Hi.
Vera. Hi.
Thank you for joining.
No. Lovely talk. I really enjoyed it. I was just wondering. So you talked about Qurratulain Hyder, who of course moved to Pakistan and then moved back to India, right? And then Intizar Husain, who moved to Pakistan but has this nostalgia for the land he once belonged to. So I'm just wondering, maybe you touched upon this in your thesis. What is these writers' relationship with the idea of India? I'm thinking here of Manana Ahmed and Pakistan and all that, right? And so, in that context, is it like, especially Qurratulain Hyder, is she attached to the state of India or the idea of Hindustan? If you get.
I think thank you for pointing that out. I didn't have time to actually delve more deeply into these examples of these writers, but of course they've led fascinating lives. And as you pointed out, someone like Qurratulain Hyder, she left India for Pakistan, I think at late 40s, early 50s, and she stays in Pakistan for about a decade and then returns. And therefore, she's very much claimed by both India and Pakistan as their own. Even though, and I think she never fully explicitly talked about it, because also I would recommend you to look at her interviews, the published interviews of her that are available, because they get progressively more and more unhinged, because she gets more and more annoyed at everyone who's interviewing her, and she keeps saying things like, stop asking me these annoying questions. So I think people keep to try and tease this question of, why did you move back? What happened? What was the response in Pakistan? Because obviously, Aag Ka Darya, when the novel was published, was controversial, because a lot of people at that time in Pakistan saw it as like this pro-India nostalgic text that didn't really talk about Pakistan, and was invested in, like, what was dangerous even. And she doesn't explicitly say that it was the reason why she moved, this reaction that she got, but I would suspect it had a role to play. And I think she is clearly, through her writing, that emerges, especially even in the way that she revises Aag Ka Darya into the translation, The River of Fire, the way she kind of, even her other novels, I think she's very much invested in a civilizational idea of India. And I think for her, the Indian nation state, at least in how, the form that it was in that time, seemed to represent it slightly better than the direction particularly that she maybe thought Pakistan was going into, with where she felt that because in a rush to create a new identity, there was this sense of disavowal of that shared past more explicitly in mainstream Pakistani culture, amongst a lot of amongst a lot of intellectuals or public figures at that time. And I think that perhaps and again, I think the big factor was obviously the strong presence of Indian Muslims as a minority and a force, as a very visible in India, and I think that definitely played a role. Intizar Husain was a more interesting and more, again, hard to pin down example, because his reason for moving to Lahore was, he says, there was a big, I think he described it as there was a big बाढ़ आई थी और मैं भी तिनका बन के आ गया था, like there was a big flood and I was just a twig in the flood, but also that he got a job in Lahore, so he went. And obviously a lot of these people who moved for very understandable reasons of like employment, because at that time that's kind of how they were, they had these very real material concerns that were driving their decisions to be in one country or another. And he clearly was, well loved in Pakistan. He got the Sitara Imtiaz. He was, but his writing, I actually find it quite interesting that even in the virulent phase of like Islamicization, post Zia, etc., Hussain somehow remained. I mean, I think people were critical of him a bit, but he somehow still managed to remain unscathed and kind of like fairly well regarded, because if you look at his novels, they are so critical of the Pakistani project, of the nation state. And I think, of course, like he would keep coming back to India. He, returned often. People like Rafshanda Jalil write very fondly about his like last trips and the places and she translates, I think, his second book with a little kind of with his blessing. So he was very happy for Indian Muslims or to take on his legacy, because he saw it as shared across both sides of the border. So I think he saw himself very much as a civilizational, as an inheritor of a broader civilization, and it didn't particularly see himself as Indian or Pakistani in the way that we understand it in the present uh, moment. So yeah, thank you for that. That was a very good question.
Thank you. Thank you.
I don't think we have any other questions from the participants side. If anybody has any question, I think you can share your email address over the chat box as well.
I'm happy to. I'll just drop it here. Yeah. Happy for anyone to shoot me an email if they have any questions. But yeah, thank you so much for joining, everyone.
Yeah, I mean, as we come to the conclusion of the discussion, I would like to extend my sincere gratitude to both of you for the intense discussion. It wasn't just intellectually stimulating and to my understanding, but it was also deeply humane because somebody who's not aware about not really well read or well versed with the literature that is existent in the scholarship of memory and loss and Indo-Muslim identity in South Asian with regards to the partition and all. It was very interesting to know things that I have just read because I have heard Hum Dekhenge by Faiz Ahmed Faiz in the recent protest, and you see protesters using it quite oftenly. And to see the significance and the genesis of the whole ghazal, nazm, novels, existing literature, the forms of literature that have been contested all together in that scholarship was quite interesting for me. And I'm sure that the participants also had the same take on your discussion. It was
I'm
really,
glad. I'm glad. I'm glad. I mean, that was the intention. So I'm glad that everyone was able to follow. Like, yeah, I was
yeah.
trying to make it a bit more general, although I know there are moments where it gets quite specific. But yes,
I have taken my notes for that, and I'll do my homework for them. And yeah, again, a sincere gratitude and thank you for joining us, all of the participants. Anybody has any doubt, they can contact Dr. Zahra through the email address posted in the chat box. And Dr. Sumaira as well. I extend my gratitude to your discussion. It was amazing for the way that you have articulated Dr. Zahra's presentation into the arguments that also sort of anchors how you and your scholarship has been and your research has been. So yeah, that would be it from my side.
thank you so much,
Thank you
everyone.
so much.
Thank you so much, Sumaira. So appreciate it. Thank you so much, Anshika and Kashif and everyone else for joining. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
As mutual. Bye bye.